Dear Ambassador, dear friends, it is a great pleasure for me to chair, on behalf of the Society for Hellenism and Philhellenism, founder of the Philhellenism Museum, this session on the power of classics and the impact of the Greek Revolution on American culture and politics. Actually, this element is a cornerstone of the special exhibition on the American Philhellenism that our museum launched last month in cooperation with the American Embassy in Athens and Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt. As of mid-18th century, the West understood after Winckelmann that the classical world attained a peak of perfection during the Athenian democracy. Barthélemy introduced classical Greece in the educational system, which produced many generations of well-educated children like Lord Byron. In America, the founding fathers adopted these principles when they built the United States. The main architectural and aesthetical lines of the emblematic public buildings affirm that the new nation decided to adhere to the values of the Athenian democracy. This is also confirmed by the fact that more than 240 cities and villages took names after the classical antiquity. This trend evolved progressively also in Europe until Lord Byron formulated a revolutionary wish through his work Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, that Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization, might still be free again. Childe Harold was for many years the #1 bestseller in America and an inspiration for many charismatic figures like Edward Everett from Harvard. Everett traveled to Greece before the Greek Revolution, embracing the same ideals with Lord Byron. When he returned to Boston, he became the heart and the brain of the American Philhellenic movement, in line with the legacy of Lafayette, who was a model and an inspiration for many generations of young Americans and a distinguished Philhellene himself. All this gave birth, after 1821, to a Greek fever in America, which impacted American society, offering a boost to political and social activism and the evolution of American culture. Many American volunteers participated in the Greek War for Independence. Others played a determinant role in raising funds and delivered to Greece the biggest foreign aid that the new state received. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe is a remarkable example. Greek fever also impacted the work of poets and writers like Edgar Allan Poe or Fitzgreen Halleck. It even became the central symbol of the abolitionist movement. Indeed, the famous marble statue of Hiram Powers, entitled The Greek Slave, was inspired by the story of Garifallia, an 8-year-old slave from Psara who was rescued by the American consul in Smyrna. It became the central symbol of the anti-slavery movement in America. As it was the case in Europe, the Philhellenic movement gave also a boost to the feminist activity in America. Philhellenism was one of the few causes which was noble enough to justify an extensive involvement of women in social life. Julia Ward, Samuel Howe's wife, was a great Philhellene and a pioneer social activist, a pacifist, and a suffragette. The Society for Hellenism and Philhellenism awarded last week the first Lord Byron International Prize to former Secretary John Kerry, a direct descendant of Thomas Winthrop, the chairman of the legendary Philhellenic Committee of Boston, paying, through this prize, tribute to the American Philhellenism. I will now pass the floor to a distinguished speaker who will address this subject in detail. Katherine Fleming is the Provost of New York University and the Alexander Onassis Professor of Hellenic Culture and Civilization in the Faculty of Arts and Science, a historian specializing on modern Greece, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean. She is also an associate member of the History Department of the École Normale Supérieure de Paris, and most recently, the co-founder of Historima, the most ambitious project of collecting oral histories to date in Greece. Ms. Fleming, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here in this real and also virtual space, if also somewhat surreal. So I want to speak precisely about many of the things to which our introducer has alluded, and particularly to the lines, architectural lines, quite literally, of Washington, D.C. that were very much inspired by what we're referring to here as a Greek fire. And as the United States Capitol was built over the course of the 1800s, its early architects looked, of course, to ancient Greece for inspiration, in exactly the same way that a few decades later, the architects of the new Athens would themselves look to ancient Greece for inspiration in precisely the same historical moment. And indeed, the two cities, Athens and Washington, D.C., even shared some of the same architects. Now, as is well known, one of the great paradoxes of this Greek inspiration is that it was filtered through the expertise of architects who were not themselves Greek. And really excellent work has been done on this problematic by such scholars as Eleni Bastea, whose book, The Creation of Modern Athens, Building the Myth, is still indispensable 20 years after its original publication. Other excellent scholars working on the interplay between Athens's early and modern architectures are also working in this area. I would say that predominant among them is Yannis Chamilakis at Brown University. He's done really interesting work on the idea that Greekness should look a specific way, or in the Western imagination, the belief that it should look a specific way, and how that thinking and those ideas shaped modern Greece, and particularly the physical presence of the Acropolis. So, in the revolutionary moment of the early 1800s, there was, if we use the title of this session, a distinctive Greek fire that undergirded revolutionary movements and their aftermaths from the United States to the eastern fringes of Europe. And Lord Byron, whom we always have to invoke at such moments, he's simply the best known of countless Westerners who saw in the Greek Revolution a vital source of passion and of inspiration. A wave of new nations struggled to emerge, starting in the late 18th century with France and the United States, on into the next century across Europe in the successor states to the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. And in seeking freedom, on another occasion we can talk about what that freedom meant or was, many of them found inspiration simultaneously, both in Greece's contemporary struggle and at the same time in its vaunted past, which was, of course, imagined in some way to be the past of them all. And in just the same way, as they constructed themselves after revolution, once again, they looked toward and at Greece, both literally and figuratively. And in the case of Washington, D.C., perhaps more strikingly than anywhere else, including even in the case of modern Athens, this also meant looking like Greece. Now, history, of course, is a really fascinating dialectic. Inspiration works in more than one direction, and it's a sort of ongoing conversation. I myself grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, beside some of the most famous battlegrounds of the early American Revolution. The Americans were inspired by ancient Greek democratic ideals. We can see this in the form of the original 13 states, which were conceptualized as city-states, very explicitly on the model of ancient Greece. We also see it in the underlying Aristotelian belief in natural law that was enshrined in early American constitutional law, and we can also see it just in the reliance on constitutions as a political form. Now, just down the road from Princeton, my older brother has a beautiful 18th century farmhouse in a place called Monmouth, the site of the Battle of Monmouth, which was fought in June of 1778 between George Washington's Continental troops and the British Army. And among those troops who fought at Monmouth was a group of Greeks led by one Dimitris Ypsilantis, the brother of none other than Alexandros, the leader of the Philikieteria. And a town in Michigan is named after him in honor of his assistance to the new America at the Battle of Monmouth, among other places. So the American and Greek revolutions illustrate this sort of historical conversation to which I've alluded. When the American Revolution broke out in 1776, among those who were inspired to fight were Greek volunteers, and then just a few short decades later, Americans returned the favor. When the Greek War of Independence broke out, Petros Mavromichalis, on behalf of the Messenian Congress, wrote a now famous missive to John Quincy Adams, who was then the US Secretary of State, asking Americans to return the favor. It was published widely in American newspapers, and it read, "Your virtues, Americans, are close to ours, although a broad sea separates us. We feel you to be closer than our neighboring countries, and we consider you as friends, as co-patriots and brothers, because you are fair, philanthropic, and brave. Do not deny to help us." And indeed, American volunteers did, in turn, travel to Greece to fight for the Greek cause. So ancient Greeks inspired Americans, who inspired modern Greeks, who inspired Americans to fight on behalf of Greece. And as the Greek Revolution raged, over on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was busy building its new capital. The site on the Potomac River that was chosen by George Washington personally to be the nation's new capital had originally been inhabited by a native or indigenous group called the Nacotchtank, who spoke the language Algonquian, as it is now called, the Native American language from which the name Potomac itself comes. But in spirit, the capital was built on a very different past, the imagined classical past of Greek antiquity. Now, the first incarnation as the nation's capital came to an early and devastating end in 1814, barely 20 years after it had been founded. Washington, D.C. was burned to the ground when British and Canadian troops occupied the Capitol, as happened again fairly recently, the Capitol building in 1812. And while this was devastating, it conveniently left a clean slate for rebuilding. And the first urban planner before the fire had been a Frenchman, Pierre L'Enfant, a military urban planner who wanted the city basically to look like Paris. Prominent in his designs and in those of subsequent architects was the spirit of Greece, even as the Greek Revolution was being discussed in real time in Congress. Greece's ancient glory was being conjured and, some thought, reconstructed in the architecture of America's emerging new capital. Now, the idea that to be truly democratic means to look Greek has proven to be a really enduring one in American politics. Donald Trump refocused our attention on the architecture of Washington and other American capitals back in December of 2020, when he issued, as you may recall, an executive order called Make Federal Buildings Beautiful Again. The order, which cites in its phraseology both ancient Greece and Rome, reads thus: President George Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson consciously modeled the most important buildings in Washington, D.C. on the classical architecture of ancient Athens and Rome. They sought to use classical architecture to visually connect our contemporary republic with the antecedents of democracy in classical antiquity, reminding citizens not only of their rights, but also their responsibilities in maintaining and perpetuating its institutions. Now, the order was greeted with a fair amount of disgust and ridicule, but Trump was here lamenting what he called the uninspiring and, quote, just plain ugly modernist architecture that had replaced the neoclassicist tastes of the founding fathers. And while, as I've said, the executive order was widely scorned for its interventionist and outdated thinking, it was just a recent iteration of a very long-standing American belief that the symbols and physical institutions of American democracy must not only look toward Greece philosophically, but must in some fundamental way, also look Greek. And I will close for you by sharing just some images, if our technical systems allow it, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about.
Thank
I
you,
may,
Fleming.
and I may not.
Is it possible?
Do we have some photographs to show?
Maybe we can do this immediately.
We can do that afterwards,
afterwards.
and we will hand off to my...
Thank you very much, Ms. Fleming.
My pleasure.
This was extremely interesting intervention. So now I will pass the floor to another distinguished speaker. Panagiotis Roilos is the George Seferis Professor of Modern Greek Studies and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University, where he also co-chairs the research seminar series Cultural Politics, Interdisciplinary Perspectives at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He is the founder and director of the Delphi Academy of European Studies and a member of the advisory board of Dionysus. Mr. Roilos, the floor is with you now.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be responding. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the beginning of the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Turks, a revolution that resulted in the foundation of the Greek state. But the establishment of the Greek state does not, of course, coincide with the origins of the formation of aspects of modern Hellenism. I use the concept origin, Ursprung, in the sense Walter Benjamin analyzes it in his Ursprung des Deutschen Trauerspiels. Benjamin employs a very interesting metaphoric image to describe his conceptualization of origins. He says that origins may be conceptualized as some kind of whirlpool or genetic material in the river of becoming. In other words, his emphasis is placed on the process of becoming. So the origins of the formation of modern Hellenism, where we mean by it, go back, as I have argued on several occasions, already to the late 15th century. There is almost no decade in the 3rd century in the fall of the Byzantine Empire, Greek and 18th century, in which Greeks, mainly scholars of the diaspora, but also scholars living in the Ottoman Empire, would not appeal to influential figures of European political and cultural life to help them liberate their people from the Turks. Today, I would like to focus on a major factor which, along with the sacrifices of the Greek fighters and the invaluable involvement of the Greek diaspora in the independence cause, was of great importance for the success of the 1821 revolution. I mean, of course, the cultural phenomenon of Philhellenism. On the American side, by the way, attracted the interest of scholars since already the beginning of the 20th century. I'm referring to an interesting article by Edward Mead, published in 27, and most recently to a monograph on American Philhellenism by Maureen Edward Santelli. So on the American side, some early manifestations of Philhellenic idealism combined with political pragmatism may be traced back at least to the activities of Thomas Jefferson. In a letter addressed to John Page, written on August 20, 1785 in Paris, where Jefferson had met Adamantios Korais, the most important figure of the Greek Enlightenment, Jefferson notes the following. It is believed that the emperor and empress have schemes in contemplation for driving the Turks out of Europe, where it is due to reestablish the native Greeks in of their own country, and with success, and to see its driven from that delightful country with whom an opposition to all science is a religion. The model is not so far departed from the ancient model. I still hope to see the life of Homer's pure from the three genius. This is not like between this only to some set of barbarians for breaking at the same time the balance among the European powers. End of quote. Jefferson views the possibility of the independence of the Greeks within the broader synchronic European political context on the one hand, and in light of dominant idealizing approaches to Greek culture on the other. Today, I address Harvard's noteworthy contribution to American Philhellenism. I would thus like to transfer you back first to 1828, 7 years after the outbreak of the Greek Revolution. In January of that year, Ioannis Kapodistrias, whom almost 1 year earlier, in April 1827, the Greek National Assembly in Trythene had elected as the governor of Greece, arrived in the Peloponnese. The same year, in 1828, a fighter and officer of the Greek Revolution and scholar, Alexandros Negris, began teaching the modern Greek language at Harvard. Negris, who happened to be a nephew of Alexandros and Demetrios Xylandis, had arrived in Boston in late 1827. In 1828, he also published his Grammar of the Modern Greek Language. The Greek title of the grammar was Synoptiki της Απλοελληνικής Διαλέκτου Γραμματική in Boston. Although, of course, it could not lay any claim to scholarly rigor or originality, Negris's grammar is important for its cultural, historical, political value. It should be viewed as an example of an early, inchoate cultural political program that aimed at familiarizing American scholars and students with the culture and language of the inhabitants of the newly established Greek state. The main corpus of his grammar was preceded by a bilingual introduction in which Negris did not fail to compare the recent heroic feats of his compatriots with those of the ancient. One of the target groups of his grammar, he emphasizes, were prospective travelers who now, after the liberation of Greece, would visit that ancient land much more frequently than before. He concludes his prologue with the following emotionally charged, enthusiastic paragraph. Quote, amidst my various misfortunes, and in my separation from my country, kindred, and friends, it is no small consolation to me to find the Greek language in general, the mother of the liberal arts and sciences, so much cultivated in a new hemisphere. And my present ambition will be fully satisfied if I can claim the credit of being the first to inspire men of learning and taste in America with the desire of becoming familiar with the living dialect of Greece. End of quote. Also in 1828, Evangelinos Apostolidis Sophocles, who according to the Dutch scholar Der Hesseling, was destined to become the first Hellenist, arrived at Boston. Sophocles had attended the Greek school in Miles, a town not far from his native Zankarathers on Mount Pelion in Thessaly. He was fortunate to have as teachers in Miles two of the most important figures of the Greek Enlightenment, I mean Anthimos Gazis and Grigorios Konstantas. After spending several years at Yale, Sophocles returned to Boston and began his teaching at Harvard in 1842. He was promoted to full professor in 1860. Upon his return to Boston in 1842, Sophocles published his own grammar of modern Greek, his Romaic grammar, but his opus magnum was the Greek lexicon of the Roman and Byzantine periods, which remains extremely useful even today. Negris and Sophocles would not have thrived at Harvard if that American education institution had not become a most hospitable place for all things Greek, due mainly to the enthusiastic and genuine Philhellenism of Edward Everett. Harvard had produced another fervent Philhellene, Samuel Gridley Howe, After graduating from Harvard Medical School in 1824, Howe went to Greece, where he offered his services as a doctor at the Greek army. After 3 years, he returned to the States and raised a great amount of money for the support of the fighting Greeks. Again, in 1828, the same year that marked the transition to the establishment of an independent at the beginning of Seferis' teaching at Harvard, Howe published his historical sketch of the Revolution. He remained an enthusiastic friend of Greece until the end of his life in 1876. In the remaining part of my brief discussion today, I focus on Everett's advocacy of the Greeks' struggle for independence. Born in Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1794, Everett was admitted to Harvard College when he was only 13 years old. The precocious scholar developed a deep interest in contemporary Greece, its culture and language very early. Already in 1813, he published an extremely interesting article in the General Repository and Review. His approach to Greek culture and history was influenced by their idealization by major representatives of Romanticism and the Enlightenment, most notably Lord Byron and Adamantios Korais. From the very beginning of his discussion, Everett singles out Greek and Hebrew as the only two ancient languages that, as he stresses, have remained alive until modern times. The, quote, difference between ancient and modern Greek, he argues, is not perhaps much greater than between the Attic and the Doric dialects of the former, end quote. Everett devoted a considerable and the most engaging part of his discussion to what I would call his cultural political approach to the Greek age. Linguistic and broader cultural renaissance in Greece would happen only if the Greeks became independent. Cultural progress and freedom go hand in hand, he professed, in a manner recalling Adamantios Korais' views. This approach to Greek cultural tradition and contemporary politics was shared by the majority of Greek literati and the Philhellenics alike, in whose imaginary Greece, its present and its glorious past, had been shaped under the influence of the Enlightenment and Romanticism. That the language could be restored to its primitive purity without restoring liberty and perhaps independence to those who are to speak it may be doubted, Everett maintained in that article. In his attempt to convince his readers that contemporary Greeks are indeed worthy of their glorious heritage and capable of achieving their cultural resuscitation, Everett praised the educational initiatives of Greek scholars and the literary production of Greek writers. He provided useful information about the teaching of the Greek letters in different cities and towns of the Ottoman Empire, as well as translations of ancient Greek and European works into modern Greek. For instance, he refers to the activities of a major scholar of the time, Benjamin Lesbios, who was also a teacher of the school in Kidonias, Evalik, in Asia Minor, to the patrons of Greek letters, the brothers of Simas from Epirus, to Athanasios Christopoulos, an influential Greek poet at the time, and several others. But of course, Everett singles out Korais as the most significant and influential Greek scholar of the time, and he praises especially his initiative to produce editions of ancient Greek authors. Indicative of Everett's attempt to engage his readers' interest in modern Greek letters is his compilation of a list of Greek books housed at the Boston Athenaeum. Of special interest is his reference to the rendition of the New Testament into vernacular Greek by Maximus Kallipolitis. Everett mentions that a fine copy of Maximus' translation exists all in the library of Harvard College. This must be one of the earliest concrete references to a collection of books of modern Greek interest at Harvard libraries. 10 years after that article, in 1823, Everett published another important piece in North American Review on the 1st of October of that year, prompted by the recent edition of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics by Adamantium.
Yeah. I think that we lost the connection. So,
The second article.
oh. I think we have a poor connection here, so maybe I will interrupt for a while to let the audience know that the pictures that Professor Fleming would like to share with you are available through the online service of the Delphi Economic Forum. So while waiting for Professor Roilos to re-establish connection, I would like to ask a question to Ms. Fleming. Actually, how can we compare... How can we
Sorry, can you hear me?
So Professor Roilos is back. Okay.
Okay, sorry. There was issue with the line. So I was referring to a second article, major article by Everett. In that second article, published in 1823, in fact, 2 years before it was elected a member of the House of Representatives, once a noteworthy shift of his perspective on the ancient cause toward more pragmatic consideration. Everett now employs more down-to-earth arguments to convince his readers that the Greeks deserve the American sympathy and active support. Now his emphasis is placed not so much on the need of the Greek people to resuscitate their ancestral cultural glory, as rather on their exemplification of what was perceived as an archetypal struggle of Christians against Everett calls infidels, a struggle of slaves eager to live up to the standards of modern civil societies against, again, what Everett would call atrocious, uncivilized masters and conquerors. No doubt, this polarization had shaped the imaginary of most Greek fighters and the Philhellenics. By employing such arguments, Everett aimed at appealing to the republicanist values of his fellow Americans. Everett portrayed using
So I think again we have a connection.
Against the Turks as an exemplification of the American ideals of liberty and civil and political rights. It is not fortuitous that his advocacy of the Greek cause had a great impact.
Okay, we have again a connection problem. Perhaps Professor Roilos, Professor Roilos, we cannot hear you. We have a serious connection problem.
Can you hear me now?
So I will. This was a very interesting intervention, and actually a lot was happening during the Greek Revolution period in Massachusetts and Boston, and precisely Harvard. It is worth noting, actually, that I came up with a book called The 40 Immortals of Massachusetts. And you can count there around 30% of the 40 immortals of Massachusetts of that period were Philhellenes, like Daniel Webster, Edward Everett, Howe, etc. So I would like now to ask a question to Professor Fleming. How would you compare American Philhellenism to the one, the Philhellenic the evolution of the Philhellenic movement in the United States of America? How would you compare it with the evolution of the Philhellenic movement in Europe?
So I think to answer that question, I would go back to something I referred to in my talk about sort of the conversations of history and the sort of mutually informing quality of what's going on in Greece in the period, what's going on in the United States. Mm-hmm. But before I do that, I'll pick up on what you said about the immortals. It should be said that Professor Roilos himself, who is a very distinguished professor at Harvard, is following in his professional position at Harvard in this long history of Philhellenism being embedded in the academic ideals of the academy. And I would love if on another occasion we could converse with him about what he sees the future of that to be, since we're existing at a moment culturally in the United States when the value of the Greek cultural tradition as part of the academy is very much under fire and in question. So I just want to say that he very much symbolizes, and the history of his position symbolizes what you just referred to. So I think that there is much more of a sense of commonality in the Philhellenism of the United States with what is going on in Greece than is the case in Western Europe. The American revolutionaries feel themselves, like the Greeks, to be under the oppressive yoke of an empire from which they seek freedom. And in that, they find great commonality with the Greek cause. It is highly relatable for them. And I don't think that you see that the nature of the French Revolution or of, later the Risorgimento in Italy is very, very different. Those are fundamentally internal political movements, whereas the American Revolution can be conceptualized in terms not dissimilar to those of the Greek Revolution. And I think that lends a real intensity and a sense of kind of brothers in arms rather than just romantic admiration to the two movements.
Correct. I fully agree. So there is also the fact that the founding fathers founded the United States of America using as a model the Athenian democracy. So that was deeper than the approach in Europe, where Philhellenism was based on three pillars: Christianity, the sense of duty towards ancient Greece, and of course the feelings against despotism. But it was, as you said, rather romantic. And another interesting point that you raised, and also Professor Roilos raised as well, has to do with some of the pillars. Definitely Lord Byron was a pillar of the Philhellenic movement. And it is worth noting, I will give you two examples. In 1829, the #1 bestseller in the United States was still Childe Harold. And #2 was Sketches of the Greek Revolution by Samuel Howe. And I will also couple this with the fact that while Samuel Howe was touring the United States to raise money, the main element that he was using was to display to the citizens the personal objects and weapons and armory of Lord Byron. So he was using this to attract the attention. This is extremely interesting, actually, because it happened like 15 years after 1814, as you raised before. So another point I would like to raise here is, I don't know if Professor Roilos could take this point. So Harvard was in the heart of Boston and Massachusetts, and my understanding is that it played a significant role. We should remember that in 1824, 1825, Lafayette is an official nation guest in the United States. Lafayette himself is a great Philhellene. We have in the Philhellenism Museum letters that he was sending to Greece, expressing precisely his Philhellenic ideals. So Lafayette is there, he visits Harvard, he visits Boston, and then we have famous professors like Everett and Ticknor, who wrote books on Lafayette. So could Professor Roilos elaborate a little bit on the importance? We have maybe 2 minutes, just 2 minutes. Elaborate on the importance that Harvard played in shaping the evolution of the American Philhellenism.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, sorry, could you hear me now? Because you said that the connection was bad.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, as I mentioned before, Everett was a towering figure, as you know, all of us here in the panel know, of cause, not only at Harvard, but in America as a whole, and he was involved not only in the cultural politics concerning the Greek Revolution and the Philhellenic cause, but also in a very down-to-earth and very practical support of the Greek Revolution. So yes, Harvard played a very important central role. And to go back to your question, which I happened to hear, so the connection on my side was rather good, by contrast to the connection on your side. The image of modern Greeks that the Philhellenic movement, of course, propagated was a construct. It was a construct mainly of Attic ideals. And you are absolutely right that Lord Byron's figure and work was greatly influential, impact also on the imaginary of the American Philhellenics. Now, just an anecdotal detail that bespeaks the influence of Lord Byron's on Everett, but with regard a much more critical view of modern Greeks. At some point, Everett comments on the cultural state of contemporary Greeks, and he employs a distich, two verses, which are well known to Greeks, concerning Athens, the contemporary state of Athens. And he says, «Ο Αθήνα πρώτη χώρα, τίγα ιδάλους τρέφεις τώρα».
Excellent.
They were also quoted by Lord Byron.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Roilos. So I would like very briefly to close. So Professor Fleming addressed the issue of the architectural and aesthetical forms of the public buildings in the United States of America, which were defined not as a matter of taste, but mainly because they wanted to remind that the foundations of the United States are based on the Athenian democracy. And Professor Roilos, among others, referred to the valuable contribution of Harvard, which was the center in the development of the Philhellenic movement in the United States of America. I would like to thank you very much, and thank also our audience for attending this very interesting intervention. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.